It is one of the most infamous hauntings in history, not just because it terrified a working-class family in North London in the late 1970s, but because it became the only poltergeist case in Britain ever confirmed in official police records. The story begins in August 1977 at 284 Green Street in Enfield, North London. Peggy Hodgson, a single mother, lived there with her 4 children. Margaret, aged 13, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7. Life was hard enough already. Peggy worked tirelessly to provide for her children, and the little house, modest, crowded, and worn, was their whole world. But one night, everything changed. It started with noises, loud, rhythmic knocks that seemed to come from inside the walls. At first, Peggy thought the children were playing tricks, but soon she heard it too. Sharp, deliberate bangs echoing through the rooms late at night. Then the furniture began to move. One evening, Peggy was in the girls' bedroom when she watched horrified as a heavy chest of drawers scraped slowly across the floor toward the door as if trying to block them inside. Heart pounding, she shoved it back against the wall. But as soon as she turned away, it lurched forward again. Pushed by some unseen force, she shoved harder, straining with all her weight, but the drawers moved still, pressing against her until she cried out. Finally, it stopped, but the terror didn't. Within days, things escalated. Beds shook. Toys flew across the room. The children screamed through the nights as knocking rattled the walls and ceiling. Peggy, desperate and afraid, called the police. On September 10, 1977, 2 constables arrived, Carolyn Heaps and her colleague. They searched the house carefully, looking for intruders. They found nothing, but as they stood in the living room, something happened that made history. Officer Heaps later described it in her official statement. As she watched, a large armchair slid across the floor by itself. No wires, no one pushing, no explanation. She inspected it, checking for hidden tricks. There were none. She wrote in her report that she had seen furniture move on its own in front of her eyes. To this day, that testimony remains on record. The police couldn't help the family. They left baffled and advised Peggy to call the media. Soon the Daily Mirror arrived, and with it, the haunting exploded into national attention. But for the Hodgsons, publicity brought no safety. The disturbances only grew. The nights were the worst. Janet and Margaret would lie awake in their upstairs bedroom whispering prayers. The room was small and plain with 2 narrow beds, a dresser, and a single window overlooking the street. Their dolls and toys lined the shelves, silent witnesses to what was unfolding. It usually began the same way, 3 sharp knocks. Bang, bang, bang. Always from inside the walls, right behind the headboard. One night, as Margaret tried to hush her little sister, they both froze. The doll on the dresser, Janet's favorite, slid half an inch across the surface. Slowly, deliberately, both girls screamed. Peggy rushed in and flicked on the light. The doll sat motionless. The room was quiet, but Peggy felt it too. The air unnaturally cold, her breath faintly visible. She tried to comfort the girls, but her voice trembled. When she turned off the light again, Janet saw it. In the corner of the room, the shadows seemed thicker, heavier, like liquid darkness seeping out of the plaster. At first, she thought it was her eyes adjusting, but then it shifted. A figure, tall, faceless, still as stone. "Margaret," Janet whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you see it?" Her sister refused to look, pulling the blanket over her head. But Janet stared, frozen. The shadow tilted its head just slightly, and the sound of breathing filled the room. Heavy, labored, as if something was struggling for air. Then the bed shook. Janet's body lurched upward, her mattress jolting violently. She screamed, Peggy rushing back into the room. This time Margaret pointed too, sobbing. "In the corner! In the corner!" Peggy turned but saw only shadows. Still the cold cut through her, undeniable. She pulled the girls close, but Janet stiffened suddenly. Her small body twisted unnaturally, her head jerking back. And then a voice came out of her mouth. Not Janet's voice. "This is my house." Deep, gravelly, inhuman. Peggy screamed for the neighbors. They rushed in only to witness the impossible. Janet lifted from her bed, suspended in the air, her body rigid, her hair falling back. Margaret clutched at her sister, but Janet was pulled higher. Then, with a violent crash, she was thrown back onto the mattress. The neighbors fled in terror. Peggy held her sobbing daughters, her own tears streaming. But through it all, the deep voice rasped again from Janet's throat. "You can't make me leave." And then silence. The haunting had revealed itself. Not just noises, not just moving furniture. Something had claimed the Hodgson home. Something that could speak. Something that could touch. And though many would doubt, dismiss, or mock, the fact remained. The police had seen it. The neighbors had seen it. And the Hodgsons lived it. But for Janet, that night was only the beginning. Because she knew the truth. There was more than one presence in the house. The knocks, the flying toys, the guttural voice that called itself Bill. Those were terrifying. But they weren't the worst. The worst was the shadow. The silent figure in the corner, watching, waiting, growing darker each night. The Hodgsons could not escape the attention. Neighbors whispered. Reporters crowded outside, and the Daily Mirror splashed headlines of a haunted house across its pages. Yet for Peggy and her children, it wasn't publicity that mattered, it was survival. The nights were unbearable. Knocks echoed through the walls, toys flew across the room, and Janet woke screaming, claiming the figure was standing in the corner again. Margaret confirmed it. Even little Billy swore he saw a man made of shadow at the top of the stairs. It was too much for Peggy. Desperate, she reached out for help. That's when the Society for Psychical Research became involved. They sent two men who would change the course of the case, Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair. Maurice was an engineer by trade, but grief had drawn him into the world of the paranormal. His teenage daughter had died in a tragic accident the year before, and he was desperate for proof that life went on after death. Playfair was a journalist with a skeptical edge, cautious but curious. Together they carried cameras, tape recorders, notebooks, the tools of investigators. From the moment they entered 284 Green Street, they realized the Hodgsons weren't exaggerating. The house seemed alive. Knocks followed them from room to room. Doors slammed without warning. A marble shot across the floor, bouncing once, then rolling in a perfect straight line before stopping dead as if grabbed by invisible fingers. Maurice bent to pick it up. The marble was hot, too hot to hold for long. Playfair wrote in his notes that night, "If this is a hoax, then it is the most elaborate one I have ever seen." But the heart of it all was Janet. She was only 11, but she carried the brunt of the activity. It was Janet who was thrown from her bed. Janet who was scratched. Janet who saw the figure. And one night, it was Janet who began to speak. Maurice was adjusting a recorder when Janet suddenly doubled over, clutching her throat. Her mouth opened wide and a voice poured out. Deep, gravelly, inhuman. "This is my house." Maurice froze. The sound was nothing like a child's. It was old, rough, like a man coughing up gravel. He asked, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "Bill. My name is Bill." The Hodgsons would later learn that a man named Bill Wilkins had lived in the house before them. He had died in the living room in a chair, the very same chair the police officer had seen slide across the floor. Maurice pressed further. "What happened to you, Bill?" The voice rasped, "I went blind. Then I had a hemorrhage. I fell asleep, and I died in the chair." The investigators were stunned. How could Janet know such details? Some said it was ventriloquism, a prank. But voice experts examined her. They found the sound came not from her vocal cords, but from deep within her chest, a strain that could damage her permanently. Yet she spoke like this for hours. Recordings captured her singing nursery rhymes, mocking the investigators, even barking like a dog, all in the same guttural tone. Skeptics called it a hoax. But those who sat in that room, hearing a child's mouth produce a dead man's voice, never forgot it. The phenomena grew wilder. Furniture toppled. Curtains twisted into knots. Legos flew across the room, hitting reporters hard enough to leave bruises. And then came the night the camera caught Janet in the air. The investigators had set up equipment in the girl's bedroom, hoping to capture proof. They sat downstairs, listening to the thuds and bangs above. Suddenly, a crash shook the ceiling. They rushed upstairs. Janet was mid-air. Her small body was hurled forward from the bed, her hair flying, her arms flung back. The camera snapped, capturing the moment in grainy black and white. In one shot, she's arched in the air, as though pulled upward. In another, her body is horizontal, feet inches off the floor, mouth open in a silent scream. The photos became infamous. Skeptics said she was jumping, but neighbors swore they saw her thrown across the room, landing yards away from her bed. One neighbor, a woman named Hazel Short, claimed she saw Janet floating from her window, levitating in plain sight. She screamed so loudly other neighbors came running. Janet herself never remembered the flights. She would wake exhausted, her body sore, with bruises on her arms and legs. But while the cameras caught her in the air, they missed what she saw in the moments before. That night, before she was lifted, Janet stared at the corner of the room. The shadows there writhed, thickened, formed into a man's shape. The brim of a hat, broad shoulders. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room. And as her body lifted, she swore it was his gaze that held her up. Not arms, not hands, just the crushing weight of his will. When she came crashing down, she heard him. A whisper, not in her ears but in her bones. "You are mine." Maurice and Playfair stayed at the Hodgson's home for months. They documented more than 2,000 incidents, and still the family endured night after night of terror. Sometimes the voices came from Janet, sometimes from Margaret, once even from Peggy. Deep guttural growls echoing through the rooms, mocking prayers, demanding attention. And always the shadow was there. Maurice once wrote that when he walked through the house, he sometimes felt watched. Not by the family, not by investigators, but by something just beyond the corner of his eye. When he turned, nothing was there. But Janet knew better. She whispered to him once, "Bill isn't the one you should worry about." When Maurice asked what she meant, she only stared at the dark corner of her room. The haunting was no longer just about moving furniture and knocks in the walls. It had become something darker, and as the winter of 1977 deepened, so did the shadow. By late 1977, the Hodgson home had become a battlefield. Each night brought fresh terror. The banging, the flying toys, the voices, they never stopped. Investigators documented more than 2,000 incidents. Journalists came and went. Neighbors whispered that 284 Green Street was cursed. But for the family, the torment was personal. Janet was exhausted. Her thin frame seemed smaller each week. Margaret tried to protect her sister, but the entity taunted them both. Peggy barely slept, waiting for the next scream, the next crash. Even the boys had begun to see the shadow figure lingering in the hallways, its outline pressed into the walls like a stain that would not fade. The investigators grew desperate. Maurice Gross brought in mediums, priests, anyone who might help. Crosses were hung on the walls. Holy water was sprinkled. Prayers were whispered through trembling lips. Nothing worked. One night, as Maurice recorded Janet, the voice returned. But this time it was not just one. It was several. Deep guttural tones tangled together, as though more than one throat was speaking at once. The air vibrated with the sound. Janet's mouth opened wide, but the words did not seem to come from her. "Get out. This is ours. You cannot stop us." Peggy clutched her daughter's hand, sobbing. The investigators sat frozen, unable to speak. The shadows in the corners writhed, stretching up the walls. The girls screamed as the curtains whipped violently, twisting into ropes. A chair toppled and slammed against the wall. Then Janet's body stiffened. Her eyes rolled back, and with inhuman strength she was hurled from the bed across the room, landing hard against the dresser. Margaret shrieked, rushing to her sister's side. The deep voice spoke again, this time from all directions at once. "You cannot take her. She is mine." The church was finally called. A priest entered the house, clutching his Bible. He prayed loudly, demanding the presence leave. For a moment the house fell silent. The children dared to hope. Then the priest's crucifix snapped. The metal cracked in his hand, the pieces falling to the floor. He left shaken, muttering prayers under his breath. Even he could not banish it. The activity reached a fever pitch. Objects hurled across rooms with deadly force. A fireplace ripped from the wall. Matches burst into flames on the table. Janet was tormented relentlessly. Sometimes she woke to find herself in another room or even outside with no memory of how she got there. Once she was discovered wedged into the narrow gap between a wardrobe and the ceiling, as though something had placed her there deliberately. The shadow entity was always watching. Janet described it in whispers. Tall, faceless, heavier than the other presence. Bill might speak through her, but the shadow never needed words. Fed on silence, on fear. Maurice once claimed he saw it too. A darker patch of darkness in the hallway, vaguely human in form. He admitted later that it was the only time he truly felt afraid for his life. By mid-1978, the activity began to wane. It did not stop all at once. Instead, it drained away slowly, like a storm losing its strength. The knocks grew less frequent, the flying objects fewer. Janet still felt the presence, but the shadow lingered in silence. The family tried to rebuild their lives. Reporters moved on. Skeptics declared the whole thing a hoax, accusing the children of faking it for attention. Janet herself admitted that sometimes she played along, but insisted the true events were far beyond her control. "I didn't do all that," she said years later. "Some of it was real," and the police record remained. Constable Carolyn Heaps's testimony about the chair sliding across the floor was never retracted. The official file still sits in archives, undeniable proof that something unexplainable had been witnessed. But for Janet, the story never ended. Even after the activity died down, she could not forget the nights when she felt herself lifted into the air. The guttural voice clawing out of her throat. The stares of strangers calling her a liar. And most of all, the shadow. She spoke of it rarely, but when she did, her words chilled those who listened. "Bill was just noise," she said once. "The shadow was worse. It didn't speak. It just watched. And I knew it was waiting." Decades later, Janet confessed that she still sometimes wakes at night at 3 a.m., certain that the room is colder than it should be, that the corner of her bedroom is darker than the rest, that if she looks too long, she'll see him again. The Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most documented hauntings in history. Over 30 witnesses, including police officers, neighbors, journalists, and investigators, swore they saw things that defied explanation. The Society for Psychical Research recorded hundreds of hours of evidence. Even skeptics admit the sheer volume of testimony is staggering. But no one could ever truly explain what happened at 284 Green Street. So what do you believe? That a family faked 2 years of terror for attention? That children learned to levitate, speak in multiple guttural voices, and move heavy furniture on their own? Or do you believe what the witnesses saw? Presence, a voice, a shadow, one that claimed a house in Enfield as its own, one that refused to leave, and one that may still be waiting in the dark corners of homes around the world. The Enfield case was real enough to make the police put it on record, real enough to convince journalists, neighbors, and researchers who stood in that house, real enough to scar a family forever. But whether you call it a poltergeist, a restless spirit named Bill, or something older and darker that wore his voice like a mask, the truth is the same. Something walked the halls of 284 Green Street. Something watched the Hodgsons from the corners of their own bedrooms. And if the shadows in your own room feel just a little too heavy tonight, pray it's not watching you too.